Welcome to Karen Stories, where the wildest Karen encounters unfold. Get ready for hilarious, unbelievable, and shocking moments as Karens make the most outrageous demands. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to never miss a crazy story. Let's dive in. Karen had always been the kind of neighbor who made life difficult for everyone around her. She wasn't just nosy, she was entitled, always watching, always prying, as if the entire neighborhood was her personal fiefdom. She monitored package deliveries, noted who came and went at odd hours, and never hesitated to file complaints about the most trivial things. But out of everyone on the block, her favorite target was Marcus. At first, Karen's behavior seemed like nothing more than the usual suburban busybody antics, a nuisance, but ultimately harmless. She would grumble about people parking too close to her driveway, or glare disapprovingly at children playing too loudly in the street. But over time, her fixation on Marcus grew disturbingly personal. It started with noise complaints, petty grievances that barely made sense. If Marcus played music at a reasonable volume in the afternoon, Karen would immediately call the homeowners association, exaggerating the disturbance as if he were throwing a full-blown rave. Yet, on any given night, her own television blared through the thin suburban walls, the sound of late-night talk shows echoing down the street. When Marcus pointed out the hypocrisy, she merely smirked, dismissing him with a wave of her hand, as if his words held no weight. Then came the accusations. One morning, Karen stormed across her perfectly manicured lawn, jabbing a finger at Marcus's chest, her face contorted with indignation. "I know it was you," she spat, her voice dripping with self-righteous fury. Marcus frowned, stepping back. "What are you talking about?" "My garden," she hissed. "Someone's been vandalizing it, pulling up my flowers, trampling the soil. And you're the only one around here with a reason to do it." Marcus had no idea what she was talking about. He barely even noticed her garden, let alone had the time or inclination to destroy it. Later that evening, another neighbor mentioned seeing stray raccoons digging through Karen's flower beds. When Marcus relayed this information to her, she scoffed. "Oh, please, don't try to play innocent." But what infuriated Marcus the most wasn't her ridiculous accusations, or even the veiled threats to call the police at every minor inconvenience. It was the sheer audacity of her hypocrisy, the way she treated him as if he were beneath her, as if he had no right to exist peacefully in the same space as her. And yet, despite all that, she had been secretly using his Wi-Fi for months. At first, he didn't notice. The occasional lag during video calls, or slow-loading web pages seemed like typical service issues. But one night, as he checked his router settings, his stomach twisted at the sight of multiple unfamiliar devices connected to his network. A quick scan of their locations confirmed what he already suspected: Karen had been leeching off his internet. Marcus was furious. It wasn't just about the stolen bandwidth, it was about the principle of it. After everything, after all the complaints, the false accusations, the subtle threats, she had the gall to steal from him. And when he confronted her, expecting at least a flicker of embarrassment, or an attempt at denial, she only laughed. "Oh please," she said, rolling her eyes. "It's just Wi-Fi. Not like I'm stealing your car." Marcus felt his blood boil. This wasn't just Karen being annoying anymore. This was something deeper, something uglier. She didn't just think she was above the rules. She thought she was above him. And that was the moment he decided Karen was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. Marcus had always been patient. He had learned, over the years, that some battles weren't worth fighting. Let the petty people stew in their own bitterness. Let them exhaust themselves in their own meaningless crusades. But when he discovered that Karen had been stealing his Wi-Fi for months, something inside him snapped. It started as an annoyance: occasional lagging on his devices, buffering when he streamed movies, dropped connections during important video calls. He assumed it was just a service issue, something temporary. But then it became too frequent, too consistent. The frustration gnawed at him, until one night, after yet another painfully slow download, he decided to check his router settings. At first, he scrolled absently through the list of connected devices, expecting to see his phone, laptop, TV, the usual suspects. But then, his eyes caught something strange: multiple devices. Unknown devices. Devices he didn't recognize. His chest tightened. He clicked on the details, his stomach twisting as he traced the connection. They were coming from next door. Karen. Marcus stared at the screen, disbelief turning into cold, simmering rage. He sat there, fingers hovering over the keyboard, trying to wrap his mind around the sheer audacity. After all the complaints, after all the passive-aggressive comments, after treating him like some kind of nuisance, she had been leeching off him the entire time. The irony was so thick, it almost choked him. For a moment, He considered blocking her devices right then and there, watching with satisfaction as she suddenly lost connection mid-scroll, mid-email, mid-whatever entitled BS she was doing. But no, that wasn't enough. He needed to see her face when she was confronted with her own hypocrisy. The next morning, Marcus waited. He didn't have to wait long. Karen was outside, watering her meticulously arranged flower beds, as if she hadn't spent the last several months trying to make his life miserable. He took a deep breath, forced a polite smile, and approached her. "Hey, Karen." She barely glanced at him, too busy inspecting a petal like it was a matter of national security. "What?" Marcus folded his arms, keeping his tone casual. "I noticed some extra devices on my Wi-Fi last night. Thought maybe you should know. Looks like someone's been using it without permission." Karen didn't even blink. "Oh," she said, still not looking at him. Marcus nodded. "Yeah. And funny thing, the connection was traced back to your house." That got her attention. She straightened, blinking at him like he'd just accused her of murder. Then, instead of denying it, instead of looking remotely embarrassed, she scoffed. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. "It's just Wi-Fi. It's not like I stole your car." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had expected something, an excuse, a weak apology, even a fake gasp of horror at being caught. But this complete dismissal? The sheer arrogance of it left him momentarily speechless. "It's my Wi-Fi, Karen," he said, keeping his voice level. "I pay for it. And," she said, crossing her arms, "you weren't even using all of it." Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's not how it works." Karen smirked, as if he was the one being unreasonable. "Oh, come on. You're making a big deal out of nothing. It's just the internet. You act like I drained your bank account or something." He stared at her, barely believing what he was hearing. She had spent months making his life harder, calling in bogus noise complaints, spreading rumors, treating him like an intruder in his own neighborhood. And yet, the moment she was the one benefiting from him, she didn't see the problem. The hypocrisy was staggering. Marcus exhaled slowly. He had to be careful here. He knew exactly what kind of person Karen was, the type who would twist this into her being the victim, if given the chance. He could already hear it. "Poor me, my mean neighbor is being hostile just because I borrowed a little Wi-Fi." He wasn't going to give her that opportunity. Instead, he smiled. "Well, thanks for clearing that up, Karen." She frowned, caught off guard. "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus shrugged. "Just good to know where we stand." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, already forming the plan in his mind. Because this wasn't just about Wi-Fi anymore. This was about principle. Karen thought she could take whatever she wanted, that she could treat people like dirt and still expect to benefit from them. But she was about to learn that some things aren't free. That night, Marcus sat in front of his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He could still hear Karen's smug voice echoing in his head. "It's just Wi-Fi. You weren't even using all of it." The sheer entitlement of it made his blood boil. She had been stealing from him for months, treating him like an outsider in his own neighborhood. And yet she still thought she was in the right. Well, that was about to change. With a few quick clicks, Marcus accessed his router settings. He didn't just change the Wi-Fi password, he made it impossible for Karen to ever steal his connection again. First, he switched to an absurdly complicated password, something Karen could never guess in a million years. Then, he hid the network name entirely, making it invisible to anyone who wasn't already connected. If she wanted Wi-Fi, she'd have to pay for her own like everyone else. Marcus leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Problem solved. Or so he thought. The next morning, Marcus was woken up by the sound of furious banging on his front door. He sighed. He didn't even need to check, he already knew who it was. Dragging himself out of bed, he made his way to the door and pulled it open. Karen stood there, arms crossed, her face twisted in outrage. "Did you change the Wi-Fi password?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory, as if he had committed some unspeakable crime. Marcus blinked at her, feigning confusion. "Excuse me?" Karen huffed, shifting her weight impatiently. "Don't play dumb. My Wi-Fi isn't working. I know you changed the password." Marcus leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "Yeah, I did." Karen's mouth fell open. "You what? You can't just cut me off." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Karen, it's my Wi-Fi. That I pay for." Karen threw up her hands. "Oh, come on. I need that Wi-Fi for work. You can't just be so selfish." Marcus let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You mean the Wi-Fi you've been stealing? That Wi-Fi?" Karen's face flushed red. "It's not stealing. It's just Wi-Fi. You're acting like I broke into your house and robbed you." Marcus tilted his head. "Funny, because I never gave you permission to use it. You took something that wasn't yours." That's literally the definition of stealing. Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, don't be dramatic. It's internet. You weren't even using all of it. You probably wouldn't have even noticed if you hadn't been snooping. Marcus exhaled, trying to stay calm. Karen, I don't owe you anything. If you need Wi-Fi, pay for your own. But Karen wasn't done. This is illegal, she snapped, her voice growing shriller. You can't just hoard bandwidth when other people need it. This is discrimination. Marcus stared at her, genuinely dumbfounded. Are you seriously trying to play the victim, because I won't let you steal from me anymore? Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, in an act of sheer desperation, she pulled out her phone. I should call the police on you, she muttered, fingers hovering over the screen. Marcus let out a bark of laughter. Go ahead. Call them. Tell them you want to report me for not giving you free Wi-Fi. Let's see how that plays out. Karen hesitated, her phone still clutched in her hand. Even she knew how ridiculous that sounded. But instead of backing down, she stomped her foot like a petulant child. You'll regret this, she snapped before spinning on her heel and storming off. Marcus watched her retreat, shaking his head. He had expected her to be mad, but this level of entitlement was unreal. And yet, something told him this wasn't over. No, Karen wasn't the type to accept consequences quietly. And that was fine, because Marcus wasn't just going to cut her off. He was going to teach her a lesson. Marcus had dealt with enough entitlement in his life to know one thing: people like Karen never learn until they're forced to. Cutting off her Wi-Fi was the first step, but he knew she wouldn't let it go. She had already proven that by banging on his door at sunrise, throwing a tantrum like a spoiled child, and even threatening to call the police on him for not giving her free internet. No, Karen needed a real wake-up call. Something that would shake her to her core, something that would make her think twice before ever trying to mess with him again. That's when an idea struck him. It was petty. It was clever. And most importantly, it was going to be absolutely hilarious. Marcus grabbed his phone and dialed the one person who could help make his plan a reality. Tony. Tony was the kind of guy who had connections in all the weirdest places. He wasn't just a good friend, he was an animal trainer. Not just dogs and birds, but the kind of creatures most people would never even consider keeping as pets. And right now, Marcus needed something very specific. When Tony picked up, he didn't even bother with pleasantries. Yo, man, Marcus said, barely suppressing his grin. How do you feel about scaring the absolute hell out of an entitled neighbor? There was a brief pause. Then Tony let out a low chuckle. Tell me more. A few hours later, Marcus met up with Tony in his garage. Sitting in front of him was a large, well-ventilated crate. Inside, tiny creatures scurried about, their movements barely visible through the gaps in the wood. Rats. Not just any rats, though. Trained rats. Tony smirked, lifting the lid just enough for Marcus to see inside. These little guys? They won't bite, won't spread disease, won't do anything except exactly what I trained them to do. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And that is? They follow commands, stay in place, and most importantly, Tony said, closing the lid. They know how to make a scene. Marcus exhaled, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Perfect. The plan was simple, but brilliant. Karen had spent months calling the cops on Marcus for things he hadn't done: petty noise complaints, fake vandalism claims, accusations that made her sound ridiculous even to the local authorities. So, Marcus decided to get ahead of it. Before setting his trap, he had a little chat with the neighborhood police. The officers were already familiar with Karen's antics, rolling their eyes the moment Marcus brought up her name. You mean the lady who called in a noise complaint because her neighbor sneezed too loud? One of them asked, shaking his head. Marcus smirked. Yeah, that one. When he explained his completely harmless prank, the officers didn't just approve, they offered to play along. If she calls us again, we'll respond, one of them said, suppressing a grin. But we'll make sure she regrets it. With the police on board, Marcus set his plan into motion. That night, Karen was exactly where Marcus expected her to be, glued to her laptop, desperately trying to steal Wi-Fi from another neighbor. She thought she had won. She thought she had outsmarted him. Marcus crept up to her house, carrying a large cardboard box filled with Tony's trained rats. He knew Karen well enough to guess she'd be careless enough to leave her front door unlocked. And he was right. With silent precision, Marcus nudged the door open just enough to slide the box inside. Then, with a single motion, he lifted the lid. The rats exploded out of the box like tiny furry missiles, scattering in all directions. Some darted under the couch, others climbed onto the furniture, and a few circled near Karen's feet. At first, she didn't notice, but then one of them ran straight over her foot. Karen froze. Then she screamed. Marcus bit down on his fist to keep from laughing out loud. Karen launched herself onto the couch, flailing wildly, grabbing a broom and swinging like her life depended on it. "Oh my God. Rats! There are rats in my house," she shrieked. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and immediately dialed 911. Marcus watched from the shadows, grinning ear to ear. Right on cue, the officers he had spoken to earlier pulled up in their squad car, lights flashing. Karen, still standing on her couch, waved frantically. "Officers, help me. I'm under attack. He did this to me." She jabbed her finger in Marcus's direction, her voice shaking with hysteria. One officer squinted inside the house. "What rats?" he asked, deadpan. Karen's mouth fell open. "What do you mean, what rats? They're everywhere." The officer turned to his partner. "You see anything?" His partner shook his head. "Nope. Looks pretty normal to me." Karen's breath hitched. Her eyes darted around wildly, looking at the rats, then back at the officers, then at the rats again. They were still there, she could see them. But the officers refused to acknowledge them. "Ma'am," one of them said, adjusting his hat. "Maybe you need to get some rest." Then, with a perfectly straight face, they turned and walked away. Karen stood frozen in complete disbelief. And from the darkness, Marcus laughed. "Lesson learned, Karen. Lesson learned." Marcus crouched in the shadows, his pulse steady, his breath controlled. The weight of the box in his hands wasn't heavy, but what was inside carried the weight of poetic justice. Inside, Tony's trained rats were ready. Karen had spent months making his life miserable. The noise complaints, the false accusations, the sheer audacity of stealing his Wi-Fi, and still treating him like he was beneath her. It all led to this moment. Tonight, Marcus was delivering a lesson she would never forget. Karen's house was exactly as he expected. The living room light glowed through the window, the faint blue of her laptop screen flickering as she stole Wi-Fi from yet another neighbor. Old habits died hard. Marcus smirked as he reached for the unlocked front door because, of course, Karen was careless enough to leave it that way. With slow precision, he nudged the door open just enough to slide the box inside. The scratching sounds from within grew louder as the rats sensed movement. They were ready. Marcus gently lifted the lid. And then chaos. Like tiny, furry missiles, the rats exploded out of the box in all directions. Some darted under the couch, others scaled furniture, and a few circled right around Karen's feet. At first she didn't notice. Then one ran straight across her foot. Karen froze. For a split second, there was silence, the calm before the storm. Then she screamed. The laptop tumbled from her lap as she launched herself onto the couch, her legs tucked beneath her like she was escaping lava. Her breathing came in ragged gasps as her wide, disbelieving eyes darted around the room, tracking the dark shapes that scurried over her floor, her furniture, and one that had just climbed onto her coffee table. It sat there, tiny nose twitching, staring at her. Karen's scream hit a new octave. She grabbed a pillow and hurled it at the rat. The rat dodged effortlessly. "Oh my godgetOutget, out!" She lunged for a broom, swinging wildly at the floor, at the couch, at thin air, missing every single rat. Her breathing was erratic, her shrieks of terror barely coherent. And then came the final, perfect piece of the plan. Karen, in full-blown panic mode, grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Marcus, watching from the darkness, grinned. Right on cue. The same officers he had spoken to earlier arrived, their patrol car pulling up with flashing lights. Karen, still perched on her couch, frantically waving, nearly sobbing at this point. "There are rats," she shrieked, jabbing a finger at the floor. "I'm under attack. This is terrorism." One officer peered inside her house, then turned to his partner, keeping a perfectly straight face. "What rats?" Karen clutched her phone with shaking hands, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps as the rats scurried around her living room. Her voice cracked as she screamed into the receiver. 911. "I need help. There are rats in my house, dozens of them. Someone put them here. I know who did it. He's trying to kill me." The dispatcher's voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Ma'am, we're sending officers to your location. Please stay on the line." Karen barely heard the response. She was too busy clutching her broom like a knight going into battle, swinging wildly at the air, missing every single rat. Her chest heaved, her pupils darting back and forth like she was witnessing the end of the world. And then sirens. Relief flooded through her as flashing red and blue lights reflected against her windows. She practically lunged off the couch, flinging the door open before the officers could even step out of their car. "Oh, sirs. Help me. I'm under attack." She shrieked, flailing her arms so wildly that one of them instinctively stepped back. A tall officer, Officer Reynolds, glanced at his partner, before turning back to Karen. "Ma'am, what exactly is the emergency?" Karen gestured frantically behind her. "Rats. He put rats in my house. Reynolds furrowed his brow. Who? She whipped around and jabbed a trembling finger toward Marcus's house. Him. My neighbor. This is payback, because he won't give me his Wi-Fi. The words hung in the air for a second. Silence. Then, Reynolds turned to his partner, a younger officer barely keeping a straight face. Did she just say, Wi-Fi? The second officer coughed, hiding his smirk. I believe so. Karen's eyes darted between them, her patience wearing thin. Yes. He's been hostile toward me. This is a targeted attack. He must have put them in my house. Reynolds looked over her shoulder, squinting inside the living room. What rats? Karen froze. What do you mean what rats? They're right there. She pointed wildly. But the officers simply exchanged a glance, their faces carefully neutral. The second officer stepped closer, rubbing his chin. Ma'am, are you sure you're feeling okay? Maybe you need to get some rest. Karen's breath hitched. They were messing with her. No, I'm not crazy. They're real. She shouted, her voice verging on hysteria. Reynolds nodded solemnly. Of course, ma'am. Would you like us to call animal control for your imaginary problem? Karen let out a wordless shriek of frustration. Meanwhile, from the shadows, Marcus watched, biting his knuckles to keep from laughing. Tonight had gone even better than he expected. Lesson learned, Karen. Lesson learned. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with the story of Karen's meltdown. It spread like wildfire, the tale of the woman who screamed about invisible rats and tried to have her neighbor arrested over Wi-Fi. The once overly confident, self-righteous Karen was now a shell of her former self. For the first time since Marcus had moved in, his door remained blissfully knock-free. No more pounding at sunrise. No more entitled demands. No more passive-aggressive notes stuck to his mailbox. Karen had disappeared. Well, not literally. She was still there, but she wasn't the same. She no longer stormed around the neighborhood, glaring at people and issuing complaints over minor infractions. She didn't call the HOA about someone's lawn being half an inch too tall. She didn't even dare look in Marcus's direction. Neighbors who had once dreaded interacting with her now whispered behind their hands, chuckling about her downfall. Someone had even seen her deep cleaning her living room in full hazmat gear, gloves, and a mask, scrubbing every surface like it was contaminated with nuclear waste. Marcus had to bite back a laugh when he saw her spraying her entire porch with disinfectant. It was clear the incident had shaken her to her core. She had spent so much time making others miserable, but the moment she was on the receiving end, she crumbled. Tony, still proud of his trained rat's stellar performance, stopped by with a smirk. Dude, I don't think she's ever going to recover from this. Marcus leaned back in his chair, stretching. Good. Maybe now she'll think twice before messing with people. Later that evening, one of the neighborhood cops, the same one who had kept a straight face while pretending not to see the rats, passed by Marcus's porch with a grin. You know, he said, tipping his hat, I don't think we'll be getting any more ridiculous calls from her. Whatever you did, worked. Marcus chuckled. Sometimes, you gotta get creative. And just like that, peace was restored. No more freeloading, no more harassment. And best of all, no more Karen. As Marcus sat on his porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of amber and violet, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. No more passive-aggressive stares from across the street. No more entitled demands for things that didn't belong to her. No more unwanted chaos knocking at his door. Karen had finally learned her lesson. And it wasn't just about Wi-Fi. Karen had spent months treating Marcus like he was beneath her, filing false complaints, playing the victim, expecting free benefits while offering nothing but hostility in return. But the moment she was forced to face the consequences of her own actions, she broke. For years, she had believed herself untouchable, shielded by her arrogance and a false sense of superiority. She had seen Marcus as an easy target, someone she could control, manipulate, take from without repercussions. She was wrong. Because respect isn't something you take. It isn't something you demand. And it sure as hell isn't something you get when you treat people like garbage. Karen had been given every opportunity to do the right thing. She could have admitted she was stealing. She could have apologized. She could have simply left Marcus alone. But instead, she doubled down. She lashed out. She played the victim when she had no ground to stand on. And in the end, she lost. Marcus didn't need revenge to be cruel. He didn't need to stoop to her level. All he had to do was show her what it felt like to be on the other end of entitlement. And just like that, Karen folded. Now, she walked around like a ghost of her former self, paranoid, quiet, humbled. Maybe she had learned something. Maybe she hadn't. But one thing was certain: she would never dare cross Marcus again. As the cool evening breeze swept through the neighborhood, Marcus took a slow sip of his drink and smiled to himself. Sometimes, the best lessons aren't taught with words. They're taught with experience.